the 15th lesson of 1 Samuel. And we're going to get further behind according to the chapters because we're not going to finish chapter 14 tonight. It's 52 verses, and we're only going to get really to the first section, the end of verse 23, and then maybe a couple verses beyond that just to kind of introduce where we're going to go. I have this title called Saul's son Jonathan, and really should have expanded that a little bit. Within my notes I have Saul's son Jonathan stands out. And that's kind of my title for this. Saul's son Jonathan stands out. The whole section, other than the last 6 verses, are really about Jonathan. And if you remember kind of where we ended with, in the previous chapter, of Jonathan's fight with the Philistines, the garrison that was there, and how that absolutely just infuriated the Philistines, and they gathered together at Michmash. And so then we read a whole lot else of what happened, but if you remember, that's the way it ended, that they were there at Michmash. And so while they were gathered in a great number to punish Israel, I'll also remind you that Israel had no spears, no swords. And even close to the end of that chapter reminds us that they had to go down to the Philistines just to sharpen all of their tools. So really, when we begin to look at this, I'm going to open up with a verse that's not even in this chapter at all, just to remind you, I think that Jonathan is the young man that took to heart what Samuel said. If you remember, Samuel was closing out this period of going from the judges or from the theocracy into a monarchy. And so he gave that speech. I said that a lot of people call it the farewell, but Samuel's going to be around for a while yet. But he's again making that transition. But he made this statement in verse 22 of chapter 12. He says, this is Samuel. He said, "For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it hath pleased the Lord to make you his people." Now, this chapter is actually proof of that promise. And it's proof also that none of Samuel's words, again, ever fell to the ground. You'll hear me emphasize that over and over again, because it is proof that there was one man who took Samuel's words to heart. Now, I've divided this particular chapter into 3 parts. The first section is going to have to do with Jonathan again, taking on the Philistines. And then it's going to have to do with Jonathan being rescued, not from the Philistines, but from his own father. And then the final section has to do with Saul establishing his kingdom against the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Amalekites, and some other ites. And he's making sure. Now, not everyone is going to have the same titles when they look at this chapter and how they break it apart. Some will emphasize a character, a verse, or something in particular. I'm going to give you my logic to this. And so as we look at this, first off, I've broken it up. Most of them will all divide into the same verses. And so you'll see this, verses 1 through 23 is where I will just simply call this God uses Jonathan to deliver Israel. Well, that's kind of what he did back in chapter 13. And we're going to see that. But the second part is God rescues Jonathan from Saul. And that takes from verse 24 all the way to verse 46. And then finally, as I said, God uses Saul to recapture the kingdom. In other words, the Philistines, the Amalekites, many of the other ites that were around them, to the west, to the east, to the north, all of these different enemies were surrounding Israel and had infiltrated into their land and taken much of their land. Well, that's not going to be anymore. Saul is going to make sure, and he's going to fight against them and take them back. In this first section, where I say that God uses Jonathan to deliver Israel, I take the very final verse of that whole section, where it says, "So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed over to Bethaven." Now, the reason why I do that is because not that this verse makes the statement that Jonathan was used of God to save Israel, but because every verse prior to that proves that particular point. And to me, it's kind of obvious, just like last week with Jonathan. Remember, there was 3,000 men, 2,000 of them went with Saul, and that got whittled down to about 600, and you'll see that number again in this chapter. And only 1,000 went with Jonathan. But when he begins to fight this battle, there's not 1,000. There's him and his armor bearer, and that's it. There's 2. That's all. But then when we get to the idea of Jonathan rescuing, or God rescuing Jonathan from Saul, and he did so because of what had transpired, what had taken place, and then we'll get into all the details about it from verse 45. "And the people said unto Saul, Shall Jonathan die? Who hath wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid, as the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground. For he hath wrought with God this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, that he died not. Now, you'll find more out about it. We're not going to be able to get into that tonight, but you'll get a sense of it as we get started. And then, of course, in the third section, that final section, where I already gave you that verse, "So Saul took the kingdom over Israel," meaning that he expanded the kingdom. He established the kingdom, and he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the children of Ammon, against Edom, and against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines, and whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them. In other words, he was whooping them. He was taking care of things. So, as we look at this, again, I'm not so sure that if you look at this, that Saul, he made some rash decisions, and he has done so from the very beginning. He doesn't seem to be a very sensitive man to the Lord. And he seems quick to insert his own concepts and decisions and ideas over the Lord's. Now, the monarchy is being established, but it's being established in spite of the fact that Saul has already been rejected as king. Remember, in the last chapter, Saul disobeyed the Lord in offering those sacrifices, in offering the burnt offering. And Samuel told him, if you had just obeyed, your kingdom would have been established. But in fact, he said this to him. He said, Samuel said to Saul, "Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue." Now, God did not leave Israel the moment Saul disobeyed the Lord. He didn't even leave Israel in a lurch. Even though Saul was no longer going to be king, eventually, that would be in his timing, it is still, to me, a chapter and a testament of a chapter, to me, of God's grace and mercy. So it begins with Jonathan making a bold and courageous statement to his armor bearer in verse 1. Again, even though I'm only going to go through verse 23 tonight, I'll get into, like I said, the next section a little bit. But I'm not going to show you all the verses that are here, so we're going to jump through some of them a little faster than others. But it says, "Now it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said unto the young man that bare his armor, Come, and let us go over to the Philistines' garrison." Remember, that word has to do with a fortification. In other words, their there, and they're controlling, and they're guards, and they have watches. They're very careful. So there's some armor that's there and involved, as well as the men that are protecting him. But it said also at that last little part, but he told not his father. Now, we're privy to that little bit of information, and that'll come into play as we go through a little bit further. But it's kind of interesting when you think really about Jonathan. Jonathan's a very humble, to me, young man, but a very faithful and courageous young man. In fact, I will tell you that I think that Saul only looked to himself and his kingdom when he'd made the decision last week that we looked at in chapter 13, that he did not look forward enough and with enough faith to being able to be dependent and wait on the Lord. He only cared about himself and cared about right now rather than looking for his son, which was Jonathan. He was the eldest, and he would have been the next king. And he would have been, I think, a worthy one. But here what we see in verse 2 is a striking contrast. Where is Jonathan? Well, he's closer to the Philistines than Saul is, and he's looking forward to, and he's paying attention to their battlements, to their garrison, to their fortifications, which they're right there in a valley close by. And he says, let's go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he told not his father. Now notice this about his father. And Saul tarried in the uttermost parts of Gibeah. That means away from where the Philistines were. Jonathan, on the other hand, is like right next to where the Philistines are. But Saul is way on the other side of their country of Gibeah. And where's he at? He's under a pomegranate tree. He's in the shade. And the people that were with him were about 600 men. Well, that's where they were before. Jonathan stands out in these two verses to me as a man of faith and a man of courage. Jonathan had already attacked the Philistines' garrison with 1,000 men. But now it's just going to be him plus one other. He also stands out for the fact that he did not tell his father either before or after. But he didn't need to tell anybody, for his actions were well known shortly thereafter. It takes place, something happens, and people are starting to notice. This is, again, a protected position of the Philistines, and there's just a small pass that's there that if Israel wanted to attack, they had to go through this small pass. Well, that's exactly what Jonathan's going to use to attack. So what do we see? He left it in God's hands, and he knew that God can save whether he had 1,000 men or just one, or if it was just him. In verse 4 we read, and Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, come and let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Why would that be thrown in there? He's reminded that he is of the circumcision. This is not just an act, a fleshly act. This is a reminder of the sign of being a part of the covenant of God. And the Philistines were not a part of that covenant. So let's go over under the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. Now, how many times do we say that? You know, well, we don't have enough people. We don't have enough money. We don't have this. We don't have that. Look, here's a good encouragement from Jonathan. Jonathan says, we don't know. But one thing we don't know if the Lord's going to deliver us or not, but here's what we do know. God is not restrained by numbers. That God can save by many or by a few. So Jonathan had a plan. And he looked for a sign from the Lord. And what he would do was, he said, we're going to make ourselves known to the uncircumcised Philistine guards. And when we do that, we're going to say something. Now, well, let's just get to the verses 9 and 10. He says, if they say unto us, tarry, we will come to you, then we will stand still in our place and we will not go up to them. Of course, I'm sure at that time he wouldn't have stood still. They would have hightailed it out of there. But what does he say in verse 10? But if they say thus, come up unto us, then we will go up. But here's the kicker, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hand. How did he know that? Because he'd already prayed about it. It's just like Gideon. He wanted a sign. So that's what he was doing. So he said he knew that the Lord delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us. I do not believe that was a presumptuous act, but it was a plan of faith. Now, this was not an easy task to accomplish. This was a single act of faith, of bravery and courage, and this act would change the minds of the men of Israel and embolden them and even his father to fight the battle and win. Saul had fallen because of his lack of faith and his act of obedience. But Jonathan is elevated. Jonathan had risen up because of his faith and because he did not seek any admiration. He didn't seek any commendation. He didn't seek anybody's pat on the back. That's again why I think that little note, why he did not tell his father, because Jonathan sought no praise. He sought nothing other than to deliver his people from these uncircumcised heathen. Again, it may be that God would be pleased to use him, and we know from reading the story, indeed, God was blessed. I should say God blessed him by using him. He became an instrument in God's hand to deliver Israel, to edify and to encourage Israel to fight. You'll even see that Saul became encouraged and emboldened to fight and restore the kingdom because of this. Well, what happened? They revealed themselves to the Philistines. The Philistines showed no fear. In fact, the Philistines mocked them and said, oh, look at who's come out of their holes. That's basically, they said it in a very mocking way. They mocked them by exclaiming the Hebrews had come out of their holes. So when the Philistines gave the sign Jonathan was looking for, then in verse 12 we read, Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come after me, for the Lord hath delivered them into the hand of Israel. Now again, this was not an easy battle. The attack was not an easy assault. In fact, you'll read where they climbed up into this area on hand and foot. So I believe that they were keeping low to the ground, but also they were climbing. This was a treacherous way to go. So they took a way in which the enemy, I think, too, also would not expect them because they'd already said, hey, here we are. What do you want us to do? Come down, or you want to come up to us? Well, you come down to us. Okay, we'll be right down. Well, they weren't right down. They snuck their way around. And what happened? It says, and Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet, and his armor bearer after him. And they fell before Jonathan. They're talking about the Philistines. And his armor bearer slew after him. And that first slaughter with Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men, within, as it were, half an acre of land, with a yoke of oxen might plow. So it's not a very large area. Though you're talking about a very small area. But he took out 20 armed guards in a very small, rough area, very rough terrain. But that's not all that happened. If we look at verse 15, notice this. And there was trembling in the host. Now you might think at first that's the host trembling. No. This trembling in the host in the field and among all the people. In other words, it covered their whole area, even the spoils spoilers, they also trembled, and the earth quaked. So it was a very great trembling. There was something else going on, and these men knew it. In fact, they knew it so much so that they were now fearful. This was a trembling of the earth. It was a trembling of the Philistines, and it caused them to run in fear. Matter of fact, it became so much so that notice who took notice. There were those who were watchmen, as in every case. Just like here, Saul had his men that were keeping an eye on the garrison and on the Philistines. And it says, and the watchmen of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away. What does that mean? They began to shrink. Why were they shrinking? Because they went on beating down on one another. They were trying to get away. In fact, they didn't know what was going on. They ended up killing one another. But they were throwing one another out of the way. They were killing their own men. They were shrinking their own army right in front of the eyes of the Israelites. So because of that, when the news came back, Saul knew something had happened. In fact, he knew someone had to have done something. Somebody had gone to battle, and he wanted to know who. So in verse 17 we read, then said Saul unto the people that were with him, number now, and see who is gone from among us. And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor-bearer were not there. Well, how about that? So what happens in the meantime? Interesting, Saul asked for the priest and the Ark of the Covenant of God. And usually when you're doing that, you're doing it for the purpose of seeking, well, what is it that God would have me to do? Well, while speaking to the priest and asking him to seek guidance, because he did actually want that, then all of a sudden Saul stops him, basically stops him from seeking God's direction. Why that happened? He got his answer, I think, from the sounds and the screams of the enemy. He could hear what was going on. Maybe he got down there close enough, and Saul and his men know what's going on, so let's just go after him. So we read in verse 20 then, Saul, his men, and Jonathan, and all of his men now engage in the battle. So Saul and all the people that were with him assembled themselves, and they came to the battle, and behold, every man's sword was against his fellow. Meaning again, remember, they don't have the swords. They don't have the spears. But God uses the spears and the swords of the enemy to kill themselves. So every man there, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was a very great discomfiture. In other words, confusion. They were killing each other. Now, what we'll find out then, something quite interesting, is as we close in towards the end of this section, that when they got to the battle, they saw the Philistines were killing each other. Then all of a sudden, some other Hebrews pop out of the whole story. Verse 21 tells us, moreover, the Hebrews that were with the Philistines before that time. Why they were with them? Maybe they were captured. Maybe whatever reason they were with the Philistines. Maybe they were slaves. Maybe they were part of the force that would help to supply them with their food, the very lowly people that were there. But all of a sudden the Hebrews that were with the Philistines before that time, which went up with them into the camp from the country round about, even they also turned to be with the Israelites that were with Saul and Jonathan. So all of a sudden the numbers got larger. But that's not all. Verse 22 tells us, likewise, all the men of Israel, which had hid themselves in Mount Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines fled, even they also followed hard after them in battle. Now you notice why I'm saying that God used Jonathan to deliver Israel? Everybody else is engaged in the battle. You can go back in there and you can read in chapter 13 and chapter 14 where it says Saul is defeating the Philistines. But he's getting the credit, but he's not the one who should get the credit. I think that God is showing you who should get the credit, and that's Jonathan. So that's why we end up with verse 23. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed over to Beth Haven. In other words, they pushed them and pushed them and pushed them back to the borders of their own country. So here we've got our first section again, that God uses Jonathan to deliver Israel. God is going to rescue Jonathan from Saul in verses 24 through 46. Well, how does that happen? If you haven't read ahead yet, we'll give you a little bit more, because here's how it starts out. Again, Saul just seems to make some very rash, foolish decisions. His leadership is full of bad planning. So unlike Jonathan's plan, which I believe it seems to be clear to me that Jonathan's plan included the Lord, Saul mentions nothing about the Lord and doesn't seem to be anything about the Lord at all included in this. So let's look at verse 24 for just a little bit there, where it says, "And the men of Israel were distressed that day." Why? They were worn out. They were fighting. How were they fighting? They did not have swords and spears unless they were able to pick them up from the enemy. But they were distressed that day, and here's what he says: "For Saul had adjured the people," really commanded the people, saying, "Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged on mine enemies." Not the Lord, but me, so that I may be avenged on mine enemies. So none of the people tasted any food. They didn't eat. So what do we see? Now we'll go a little bit further in this. "And all they of the land came to a wood, and there was honey upon the ground." Aren't we in the land of milk and honey? Yeah. Provisions right there on the ground. "And when the people were come into the wood, behold, the honey dropped. But no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath." Anybody that touches it, they're going to die. They're cursed. So what do we see? Verse 27. "But Jonathan heard not when his father charged the people with the oath. Wherefore he put forth the end of the rod that was in his hand, and dipped it in the honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes were enlightened." He didn't get some special revelation. That means that he got the light back. And you know, when you're tired, you're worn out, and you can see it in a lot of us. Wednesday nights, you can see it in a lot of your faces. You're tired, you're exhausted. This was from fighting. They needed food. They needed something. They needed some sugar. And that's exactly what he did. And when it says his eyes were enlightened, and so, well, we're going to stop with that because of what takes place in the rest of this, and we'll see it. But I will give you this one little bit, one other little part of what happens, a little getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but I want to show you this. Because when they told him, "Jonathan, your dad said anybody that eats that's going to die." Here's what Jonathan said: "My father hath troubled the land. See, I pray you, how mine eyes have been enlightened, because I tasted a little of this honey." Look at what happened. Saul is troubling the land, troubling the people. Jonathan was more forward and faithful-sighted than was his father. But we'll get into that next week. So So hopefully encourage you to read ahead a little bit, find out a little bit more as we're able to discover some things. I think when you look at this, and it's why Jonathan and David, why their hearts were knit together. Why was it? Because they both loved the Lord. Because they both had an appreciation for God's leadership in their lives. I believe that Jonathan was also a man after God's own heart. But Saul ruined his monarchy. But of course it was part of God's program and plan altogether. But I know that we've got more to learn from that